Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 14 of the semester, the end of the lessons. Chapter 14 deals with Oceania, Australia, and Oceania, however you want to view it. I hope you're doing well. And without further ado, let's get going on the Google Earth tour. So let's begin in the more obvious region. So that would be Australia and New Zealand. So Australia is a very large island continent. It is a very large piece of continental crust. It is lightly populated, even though it's roughly the size of the United States, or comparable anyway in size to the United States. It is very lightly populated. The majority of people live in the southwestern region. So if you zoom in on that, you get to cities like Perth, Australia, and Rockingham, and Banbury. Look, there's even an Albany. Not surprisingly, English background, right? You can see the shading of green from forests near the tropical southwestern corner there, or subtropical rather, and then grasslands and eventually dry. As you pull away and you look at to the northwestern portion, in the western portion, it's very, very dry. So Western Australia, Northern Territory, South Australia, this is the outback. This is very dry desert. About 75% of Australia is considered arid to semi-arid. It isn't until you get to the very northern portion that it is mostly tropical, as its proximity to the equator would indicate. So Darwin, Australia would be probably the more significant town in this part of the country. You head to the northeast and you get into a more wet climate, proximity to the ocean. This region is subject to tropical cyclones. You have the city of Cairns. You have basically, I believe this is Queensland, so the province of Queensland, and here you have the Great Barrier Reef. It is the largest single collection of living organisms on Earth, and it is visible from space. It has been subject to significant die-offs in the years 2016, 17, and 2020, and it has made a bit of a comeback in 2021, so we'll see how that holds forth into the future. But like any organism, it is highly dependent on other organisms and humans. And for example, there is mining and agriculture that takes place in this region of Australia. So the runoff from those rivers that eventually drain into this very shallow ocean here has an impact on this region. As you pull away and head to the south and east, you get to Tasmania, Victoria, the Australian Capital Territory, or ACT. This is where the capital is. And here you have cities like Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney, Brisbane, the Gold Coast of Australia, very densely forested near its southern extreme. As you head into Tasmania, it's much more wet. This would be similar to what you would find in British Columbia and Washington and Oregon, capital of Hobart. Once you leave Australia, you get into New Zealand. New Zealand is basically two islands that are basically created by the convergence or confluence of two tectonic plates. So this region is volcanically active. It's also seismically active, obviously. There are volcanoes that you can sort of find across the landscape, including some big calderas from previously extinct volcanoes. And there are sort of volcanoes throughout this whole region. If you pull back and you look at this area, you see oceanic trenches that basically tie back to all the way to Papua New Guinea. So basically, whether it's in the Solomon Sea, the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, Fiji, American Samoa, and then you have the Marshall Islands, Nauru, Tuvalu. A lot of these places, Kiribati, which is a collection of island nations that are, as we'll get into the lesson, obviously a lot of these islands in what is considered Melanesia and Micronesia, they are under threat of sea level rise. That's like the biggest environmental issue going on there. This area is also significantly affected by plastic pollution. And so it's sort of a confluence of sort of human aided and human caused problems. As you can see by the Google Earth depiction, this area is really big and very spread out, not particularly heavy populated, but under threat of sea level rise as its primary climate change driver. Also, as you get into this region here, roughly tropical cyclones, if you're far enough north or far enough south from the equator, the threat of typhoons in this region becomes an ever-present danger, especially during the hurricane and typhoon season for their respective regions. So that is the Google Earth depiction. Now let's get into the lesson itself. You know, this might be an image that you have of the area. Beautiful beaches, clear water, palm trees, lazy, beautiful landscapes that become especially attractive to people from New York State in wintertime, right? Beautiful places where you want to spend lots of time vacationing and enjoying the tropical climate. So that is but one aspect of it. If you think of Australia and New Zealand, clearly they have a very different environment. But I had to sort of think of an image to me that would highlight this region, and this one came to mind. Some of the objectives from the region: you really can't get away from Asian influence, specifically China, and there is a decided colonial background or colonial echo in this region as well. Some of the key concepts and terms. Again, setting the boundaries are dominated by water, as you already saw. It would be easy to focus on Australia and New Zealand as sort of the bigger players in terms of population. But there's a lot more complexity to the region than just those two. So if you think of the region, again, Australia with its 7 provinces, you still have what's referred to as the Melanesia. These are sort of bigger islands, and then Micronesia, which includes all the way from Palau, all the way to the Tuamotu archipelago. And I think I didn't fully butcher that. You have the Marshall Islands, belongs to the United States as a sort of partnership with them. You have Guam, you have Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Solomons, Fiji, and so on. So a lot of islands that are under threat because of sea level rise, even as we speak. Again, if you think of even all the way to Hawaii, frankly, even though Hawaii is a United State, historically and ethnically, they do belong to Polynesia. So think about the idea of food staples like taro root in Hawaii or sugar cane, which becomes a staple crop and was a crop that was heavily used by colonizers way back when. That became a commodity that was really highly sought after. If you think about the physical landscape, you can think of the outback in Australia. Very dry, as mentioned earlier. About 50 to 75% of Australia is either semi-arid or arid. If you get to New Zealand, it's a bit more temperate, so you do have landscapes that are covered in snow. It is more forested, it is more subject to seasonal change the further you are from the equator. And of course, you have this, the Great Barrier Reef, which is the world's biggest living collection of organisms. When you think of Polynesia, you might think of this, beautiful landscapes of clear blue water, white sandy beaches, palm trees, beautiful, right? But just imagine 1 or 2 feet of sea level rise, and most of this is gone. So that is the threat that a lot of these individuals and countries face now. It's not a problem that's to be addressed in the 21st, at the end of the 21st century, in decades from now. This is an issue for them now, like in the next 10, 20 years. Climate. Well, the climate, not surprisingly, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand, which is B, climates are dry, A, climates are tropical. So the majority of the climate in the region fit into the A climate. So either tropical rainy, tropical monsoon, or tropical dry wet. As you head farther from the equator, so the equator is right here, as you head in this direction, they become more sea climates, climates like what you find in Western United States and Western Canada. Think of San Francisco, think of Oregon, think of Seattle kind of weather. And that's what you find in New Zealand. That's what you find in Tasmania. That is what you find in the city of Sydney and Melbourne. Okay. If you are near the equator, so the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Vanuatu, these places fit into the A climate. So they don't get very cold in winter at all, and they remain roughly the same temperature the entire year. Environmental issues. So deforestation, as you have sort of figured out by now, has been a problem in almost every region. Mining is a big deal because when you conduct mining operations, the rain and the water runoff can take chemicals and nasty things into the rivers, out into the oceans, and then they affect the chemistry of the coastal waters in the vicinity of those mines. One example of that would be what's happening to the Great Barrier Reef in spots. Deforestation, as mentioned earlier, think about an animal like the koala bear in Australia. Koala bears basically feed on eucalyptus trees. Eucalyptus trees only grow in a very, very specific region. If those trees are taken out, then you're basically removing the one food source that koala bears partake in. And so it's a very sort of finely tuned ecosystem that is expecting a certain kind of conditions to materialize. Otherwise, the system is disrupted. Exotic plants and animals. So if you introduce non-native plants, it affects local ecosystems, because if you bring something in that has no natural predator or thing that would keep it in check, it can sort of run away and take over an area, displacing the more indigenous life, whether it be animal or plant life. Again, some of the environmental issues. We'll get into a couple of these coming up. Logging, if it's not done sustainably, can have really negative consequences down the line, especially in tropical forests. The Great Barrier Reef die-off, so it was the biggest recorded one. It was in late November 2016, with additional ones in 2017 and 2020. The die-off took place as a result of warmer waters, excess sediment runoff, and mining contamination. Now, you can think of coral as being that living organism that requires just enough light It needs to be at just the right depth, and the water has to have just the right acidity. Otherwise, it fails. So that is a problem because it is a very finely tuned ecosystem, and that ecosystem is home to many other kinds of fish life in the region. So this is what healthy coral looks like. This is what dying coral looks like. This is what dead coral looks like. And oftentimes coral will bleach or whiten when it's under stress. It's not dead at that point, but it is dying. Okay? So coral should be green and red and yellow and orange in the color coral, and pink and sometimes blues. Coral, when it's dead, looks sort of like this sort of brown, which eventually falls apart and it becomes a very ghostly scene, like what you see here or here. Now, there's good news. There's been some recovery. As of late 2021, there's been a large spawning or reproduction event, which is seen as a possible sign of recovery. And this is what a spawning event looks like. It looks like a snowstorm, basically. And scientists feel that if global temperatures must remain below this 1.5 in order for coral to survive in large scales. Of course, there's more to coral survival than just temperature. Acidity is another issue. Now, keep in mind, from 1880 to 2019, according to the IPCC, the temperature of the planet has increased by that much. And that's the limit that many feel. So there's not much wiggle room. Most of the heat has been absorbed into the oceans. So at some point, that could be a problem. But this is good news, at least as of late 2021. Sea level rise is yet another problem in places that are shallow to begin with. And of course, radiation from long ago nuclear detonations in the region. And this took place in the Marshall Islands. And that is a real photo, that is not photoshopped. This is basically an above ground nuclear test in very, very shallow ocean. So again, that's a real explosion right there. That is not photoshopped in any way, shape, or form. Plastic, you've heard of this. You've heard of this quite a bit. And there's some, plastic pollution is a big deal because it is a shared problem. Meaning the pollution that we dump into the United States ocean waters will find their way somewhere else. What China dumps, and China is a big polluter. The Philippines, Australia, really just about everybody is. Some places are worse than others. But this is what happened to this seagull after consuming a lighter and then 1, 2, 3 at least soda bottle caps. There's a comb. There's all kinds of stuff in here, and this obviously affected this bird's digestion, and it eventually died, obviously. So it's a shared problem because these animals don't know what this is. For them, it just could be food. So they consume it, and then that has obviously deadly consequences. There is this happening right now. It's called the Ocean Cleanup Program, and I really, really highly recommend you watch this. This will be linked on your class weekly folder. It is relatively new, but it is something that's being done about the plastic patch. It's like vacuuming the ocean. And frankly, I was a bit leery and suspicious of it. Not that I didn't think it was a good idea, but I just thought the scale would not be possible to. And if you watch the video, you will see how much garbage they pull out of the ocean. It is a remarkable, remarkable system. Really recommend it. About 10 minutes, maybe not even, might even be 8 to 10 minutes long. but highly recommend you watch it. There's the link, and this is how they do it. They take two ships with a big old net tied between them, and then they literally vacuum the ocean. It doesn't trap fish, it lets water through, but it collects lots and lots of plastic. And when they dump the plastic, you'd be amazed how much crap they pull out. Basketballs and waste baskets and fish nets and frisbees and cups and all kinds of junk. It's remarkable. So their hope is to be able, and their goal is really, really ambitious. They hope to remove 90% of the plastic that's been dumped into the oceans. Is that going to happen? I don't know. But I bet they're going to get rid of a whole bunch of it. So that's a good thing, right? Of course, climate change, that's another thing. So the idea of, retreating glaciers in Australia, New Zealand rather, frequency of droughts and heat waves in Australia, all these are bad things. But sea level rise, which is going to happen, and by the way, this is going to happen no matter what's done right now, 3 to 4 feet by 2100. So if that's the case, you could have these climate refugees in the making. So whether you happen to be an island nation that's really low to the ground, meaning close to sea level, and homes are lost and they have to be replaced, or whether you happen to be the Tuvalu minister who addressed the United Nations recently in knee-deep water. I thought it was a bit of a political stunt, right? But a really, really well done one, in my opinion. It got the point across. Of course, landforms in the region are volcanic in nature, so a place like Bora Bora, which is a very popular tourist destination, there's an airport right there if you really can't see it. This tourist destination is the remnant of a former volcanic island, which has been weathered down and then left behind an atoll, which you see right there. Population and settlement. So this region is very sparsely populated, even in the areas where people live in larger numbers. Australia and New Zealand have stable demographics. However, the islands still have high population and high population rates. And that is made worse by the fact that they are limited in their space, right? So this image here looks very, very light in color. So basically anywhere between fewer than 6 to 6 to 25. Yet, if you look at the close-up, Southwest Australia, Eastern Australia, you have larger numbers. But even here, you don't really go much above these numbers. You don't see any of these colors. So it's a largely sparsely populated area in the region. Here's Australia, stable population, stage 4. New Zealand, same. And then you get to Papua New Guinea, and they have a more classic stage, late 2 to 3. So they're still growing. Nauru. And if you look at some of the numbers, you'll see here about the fertility rates, with few exceptions, New Zealand, Australia, and French Polynesia, everybody's still in the 2 to 4 range. So that's still higher than most places are going. So as you have probably seen throughout the semester, every region in the world, with the exception of Africa, and even Africa is dropping significantly. Africa's still in the 4 to 6 kids per woman of reproductive age. But every region is in that decided trend downward. This region here is higher than most. These numbers, obviously they will change in the next decade or so, but still population rates are relatively high. Look at some of the historical settlements. European colonization obviously restricted primarily to British and Dutch influences, with some French, and that history is still there. When you think of English, you think of Australia, you think of New Zealand, you think of Tasmania, and then French and Dutch are scattered throughout what we call Melanesia and Polynesia. Although there is more modern day American, and I mean US, influence in the region. So when you think about the modern patterns of settlement, there are some sharp contrasts. You think of a place like Christchurch in New Zealand, it could very well be a northeast United States city. And Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, a lot less developed. So there are sharper contrasts in development within the region. You think of cities, big cities, you really only find them in Australia, almost exclusively, and New Zealand. So here's Auckland, the city of Sydney, the city of Melbourne. Very well developed places with all the amenities of a large city. And as a result, these are places that are very attractive for migrants from all kinds of places. So Asian influence is obviously big, whether it be Chinese influence, whether it be Southeast Asia influence like Vietnam and Laos and Malaysia and Cambodia, okay? And here you see where the migrant flows have come from. So lots from Australia, from Europe, United Kingdom, Germany, Greece. So, or whether it be the Middle East or other parts of Asia like India, Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, even the United States and Canada. So that's migration into the region. And if you take all the numbers, you see that Europe has the large preponderance of that. From a cultural coherence and divergence and diversity point of view, there's what we would call Native Americans. These would be Native Australians, if you want to think of them that way. So these are what are called Aborigines, hunter-gatherers who dominated the landscape for a long time before the British ever showed up. And if you watch this video here, it does a really nice job of explaining some of the Aboriginal people and the context within the larger modern day Australia. In New Zealand, it parallels Australia to some extent. There's obviously British influence. There, the native population looks a little bit more Polynesian. So if you look at this individual here compared to these individuals here, the background is different. It's more Polynesian. People that would have occupied places like the Marshall Islands and Nauru and Tuvalu and Kiribati and so on. When you think about Maori, gender roles really have changed quite a bit since colonization because of the English influence, much more patriarchal. So women were robbed primarily of their status via legislation, and contemporary Maori society now resembles more colonial notions of male dominance, a patriarchal society versus a matriarchal society. From a linguistic diversity, well, English is spoken, frankly, just about everywhere in the region. English is sort of like a universal language now. It's spoken in Japan, it's spoken in China, it's spoken in many places, even if it isn't the primary language of the region. If you take a trip to Europe as an American, it's frankly quite easy because a lot of people default to English as a way of dealing with one another. So obviously you find that in New Zealand, you find that in Australia, with some combinations of indigenous languages that still persist. But throughout the region, it's a combination of any of these three and English. It's probably very easy to speak English in really any of these places. We'll talk about geopolitics, the influence of China and Taiwan in the region. There are human rights issues ongoing in Hong Kong. If you have been paying attention to the news, a lot of stress and conflict between China and Taiwan, and China and Hong Kong. China considers Taiwan part of China. The Taiwanese consider themselves Taiwanese. That's problematic. When you think of Hong Kong, they speak their own language, Cantonese, which is very different than Mandarin, even though they all probably speak Mandarin as well. So the whole idea of Australia and New Zealand being longtime power brokers in the area, this relationship with China, especially post-COVID, is highly uncertain, still very volatile. So this deteriorating policy, and again, here's a link that will be posted on your class page, is frankly very, very touchy. Australia called for an investigation of the genesis of COVID, which really pissed off China. And China went ahead and put all kinds of economic sanctions on Australia, which frankly didn't have the effect they wanted. Australia is holding strong, and it'll be interesting to see what others do. Will the United States take a strong stance against China? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I don't know if a Biden administration would do that. We shall see. And who knows what future administrations post-Biden will do. So, that's still a very sort of nebulous idea. But this is a really, really good article from foreignpolicy.com on Australia-China angst. Okay. America, long before even the Trump administration, so going back to the Obama administration, did what's called the Asia pivot. This is still ongoing, which is a shift away from the Middle East towards the Asia Pacific region, and that's still ongoing. Of course, the whole China thing kind of throws a wrench into the whole thing because it's ever changing. China is becoming a stronger military power. And the United States has had a presence in Asia Pacific region for a very long time. So that's not likely to change anytime soon. The only difference is the United States has basically strongholds in these places. But China has a stronghold in what's called the South China Sea. So that's not likely to change either. And South China Sea was discussed in week 13 as part of Southeast Asia. Native land claims, of course, there's the idea of native populations, not unlike what's happened in the United States with what are called Native American nations. And of course, you have to think about the region in terms of the future as far as like its linkages to the global economy. Think about globalization. Think about how globalization has been affected by COVID-19. Think about how it's affected domestic, regional, and global markets in terms of supply chains and how they've been slowed down quite a bit. This region is rich in raw materials, especially Australia, mining, agriculture, and these expanding markets with China being in the center of it all. I mean, like it or not, whether anybody likes it or not, China is now the biggest consumer of many things. China is now the biggest consumer of new cars in the world. And India will eventually join that. So as a result, there's a bit of a redistribution of how resources are divvied up. And current supply chains are not really able to keep up with the demand that's out there, frankly. So that's an interesting, shipping, the container ships that bring all the stuff into ports that eventually find their way into places like Walmart and Target and places like that. those chains are really slow down. COVID obviously had a thing to do with it, but more and more is post-COVID. Let's see. Let's look at the idea of social development. So again, whether it's raw materials, the shipping industry, and cities that are becoming more significant in the world market, that's becoming an issue. There's, of course, been a long time idea of, when you think of a place like this is the St. Regis in Bora Bora. If you saw the movie, I believe it's called Couples Therapy, this is where you would have seen this featured in. So tourism will always be a big part of this area. And then finally, economic systems. Oh, sorry, let me go back to here. This is the idea of gender equality. So the lower the number, the more gender equal the place is. So look, Australia, New Zealand have really low numbers, and yet other places and some of the island nations are much larger. Human Development Index, in this case, the higher the number, the better. So Australia and New Zealand are above 0.9. This is from 0 to 1. 1 would be a perfect place. No such place exists. And the lower the number, the worse off. So you have a place like Vanuatu. And you have a place like Papua New Guinea and Kiribati, where these numbers are low. So that's where I'm going to leave the lesson today. Again, it's a highly changeable set of circumstances that's affecting this region, not the least of which is the influence of China and the ever-changing influence of China. So stay tuned. I hope you watch some of those videos that were linked. And again, you can find those videos linked in the class page for the week. So for the chapter 14, Australia and Oceania chapter, you can find them there. Again, they're not particularly long, but they sort of supplement the material. And again, this material is highly changing as a function of the fact that it's human driven. So I highly recommend you take a look at those. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. If you have any issues, come to the live office hour. And otherwise, I hope you're doing well. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.